Well, happy Sabbath and good afternoon. This weekend, Ministerial Member Services is conducting its 16th annual leadership workshop here at the home office. Each year, pastors invite members of their congregations to attend this event. The church members who attend are typically looked on as leaders in their home congregation as a result of their service to the church. The focus of the leadership workshop is to encourage these leaders to develop the same type of leadership that Jesus Christ showed his disciples. Leadership through Christ-like service. While reflecting on the importance of serving others and the lessons that we will be sharing through this year's workshop, I came to realize that there is an even more fundamental aspect of leadership that comes before we are really qualified to lead others. In the 11th chapter of his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul made a statement. He wrote, "Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." It sounds like a simple statement. He was instructing people to follow him, to follow Paul's actions and do things the way that he showed them to do them. Paul was leading these Christians and instructing them, do what I do. Well, I don't know how you feel about that, but it's a little scary to think of other people doing what I do or imitating me. It may not always be wise advice. But Paul also added something. He said, just as I also imitate Christ. This points out the great challenge for leaders. A leader must be someone worth following. Before Paul could advise someone to follow him, Paul had to do something himself. Paul had to imitate Christ. If Paul wasn't imitating Christ, then it certainly would have been bad advice to tell those Corinthians to follow him. The lesson that I want to bring out in this sermonette is that it is important that we lead ourselves. We can't just lead others, direct others, and teach others, telling them what to do. We have to first be able to lead ourselves and become the type of leader who does set a good example and who is worth following. In his book, The 360-Degree Leader, author John C. Maxwell wrote this, "If you wouldn't follow yourself, why should anyone else?" Let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 30. 1 Samuel chapter 30. This chapter tells a story about David, who at this point had not yet been made king of Israel. David had escaped from King Saul at this point to the land of the Philistines. David and a group of 600 men and their households had all defected from Israel, and they lived in the land of Gath. David had asked the king of Gath, Achish, for a place where they could live. And Achish gave them a town. He gave them the town of Ziklag. So David and his men at that time, they settled in Ziklag and pretended to help King Achish to attack the Israelites, but they were really attacking Israel's enemies. And God had favored David in all of these battles that David was involved in. Things went his way. But let's pick up the story here at the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 30 and see what came to pass. Now it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag, so they were coming back home on the third day. This is the town where all of the families of David and his men were living. It says that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and those who were there, from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire. And their wives, their sons, their daughters had been taken captive. Now you can imagine how David and those men felt. They came home to find that their families were missing. Everybody was gone. Their town had been completely burned. Continuing in verse 4. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. So they were wept out. You know, they cried and wept so long that they couldn't weep anymore. That's how tragic this was to them. Verse 5. And David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. How did David's men react to this? You know, where did their anger go? Verse 6. Now David was greatly distressed. Why? For the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. David, the leader, he was suffering greatly in the same way as all the other men. His 2 wives had been taken captive. And as their leader, what was David to do? This situation would have been difficult for any leader. David's men, they were tired, they were angry, they were worried sick about their families and what had happened to them. A group of David's men spread the word that maybe they'd had enough of David's leadership. They figured it was all David's fault this had happened. They decided that they wanted to stone him to death. In this crisis, David's leadership was severely tested. Suddenly, he has to decide, where is his focus needed the most? What does he need to do? Is it to go after the attackers? Is it to build up those who were supporting him? Is it maybe to confront his own men who wanted to kill him? Well, David's answer was none of the above. Let's continue the end of verse 6, and we see David's leadership here in action. The end of the verse there in verse 6 says, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." David strengthened himself. He realized that before he could lead anyone else, he needed to lead himself. David realized that his own relationship with God here was of primary importance. If David didn't have his own self under control and aligned with what God wanted to happen, then he really didn't have a chance at leading with the right decision. David's reaction was to ensure that his focus was where it needed to be. And he did that by connecting to the true source of strength, to our God. And after David did that, we see in verses 7 and 8 that he called for the priest to inquire of God, what should they do? And God gave a very positive message in this case to David, that his men should pursue the attackers, that they would overtake them and certainly recover what was left of their belongings and everyone who had been captured. We cannot lead others when we aren't courageous and haven't committed ourselves to the vision that we want to instill in others. Leading ourselves is vitally important. Let's turn to Luke chapter 6, verse 41. I wanted to look at one of the parables that Jesus Christ spoke in Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 41. Jesus said, "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the plank in your own eye?" It's often easy for us to see someone else's faults. They're on display right there in front of us, but it's a lot harder to see our own. In this parable, your brother has just a minor problem, a little speck in his eye, but you have an enormous problem. You've got a plank in your own eye. Which problem should be dealt with first? Continuing in verse 42. "Or how can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me remove the speck that is in your eye,' when you yourself do not see the plank in your own eye? Would you trust someone to put their fingers in your eye to remove a speck when they don't have the wisdom or the intelligence to see that there's a huge plank obscuring their vision?" Jesus continued, "Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck in your brother's eye." It's a good thing to lead and to teach other people. It's a noble thing to lead and to help our brothers when they have a problem. But we can't be blind to our own shortcomings. We also need to examine ourselves. We need to work on solving our own problems. Otherwise, our leadership can be hypocritical. So to properly lead someone else, we must first lead ourselves. That means that we must examine our own lives. We have to examine our own motives. We must look at ourselves compared to what God has asked of us. We must make the right choices in our own lives and follow God's leadership to confront those challenges that we might be facing ourselves. Only then can we truly lead other people effectively. We must learn to follow God ourselves if we want others to follow us. As Paul said, "Imitate me just as I also imitate Christ." I was unable to determine exactly what article this quote I'm about to give was originally featured in, but there's a quote about leadership that's attributed to D. Hawk, the founder and former CEO of the Visa Credit Card Association and an author of several books on leadership. D. Hawk had this to say: "Here is the very heart and soul of the matter. If you look to lead, invest at least 40% of your time managing yourself, your ethics, character, principles, purpose, motivation, and conduct." It's easy for leaders to get caught up in managing those above them, those under them, and those beside them, that they can forget to manage themselves. As this quote mentions, we must make it a priority to manage our own ethics, principles, character, purpose, motivation, and conduct. These are all moral and character issues. It's not so much about leading ourselves to have new skills or new abilities, but developing that mind of Christ. Leaders need to have enough integrity in their lives so that those who are following them can trust them to lead. Leading people effectively takes high levels of trust. Who wants to follow or listen to someone that they can't trust? They might pay lip service to that type of a leader, but their loyalty isn't going to be there. A leader who compromises his character is compromising his leadership. Don't cut short the time that you need to take in focusing and analyzing that part that you yourself play in any situation. If we take the time to ensure that we do have the right motives, built on the right principles, and for the right purpose, then we can be successful in whatever we find to do. Let's now turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 25 through 27, and conclude by looking at a final passage, this one from Paul, again to the church in Corinth. Beginning in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25, Paul writes this: "And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." We are competing for a prize. Paul said in verse 27 that he disciplined his body, that he brought it into subjection. Paul knew that he was preaching to other people. He knew that he was leading other people to Jesus Christ. And as we saw at the beginning of this sermonette, Paul had told the Corinthians to imitate him, just as he imitated Christ. And how did Paul get to a state where others could imitate him? He disciplined himself. He brought his thoughts into subjection. In other words, Paul worked hard at leading himself so that he could effectively lead others. I think Paul would agree with a statement by Thomas J. Watson, the former chairman of IBM, who said, "Nothing so conclusively proves a man's ability to lead others as what he does from day to day to lead himself." What do you do from day to day to lead yourself? Invest time in managing yourself and putting on the mind of Christ. If you haven't considered the importance of this aspect of leadership, I urge you to do so. Let's do as David did and strengthen ourselves in the Lord our God.